Thank you. You're abusing your power. All right, I'm going to give you a little intro and then we'll get going. All right, our next speaker is someone that anyone who's really been in the Western Taoist world for some time will know of. A scholar practitioner. On the scholar side, he's published 14 books and 30 academic articles and book chapters, translating over 40 Taoist texts, most recently a contextual, contemplative, and annotated bilingual translation of the Tao Te Ching and traces of a Taoist immortal, Chen Tuan, of the Western Marchmount. If you've ever looked up or looked for a book on Taoism, you've definitely run into our next presenter's work. On the practitioner side, he's an ordained Taoist priest of the Huashan lineage. His literary work reflects the fact that he's not simply translating the words of these ancient texts, but rather conveying the hidden meaning lying behind the writing. As the director, chair, and scholar in residence for the Center of Taoist Studies, the education and research branch of the Taoist Foundation, Lewis gives a ton back to the Taoist community and has been a good friend of Master Zhou's Taoist Center for years. Dr. Lewis Komjathy, I'm going to let you frame your increasingly relevant topic subject, the impossibility of Taoist medicine for us. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Sam. Good to see all of you. So hello and welcome. Thanks for being here. I want to begin by thanking the Taoist Gate community and Zhou Xuanyuan for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm going to share my screen with you. Sam, you can see that okay? Okay, great. So yes, the topic on the impossibility of Taoist medicine. So just a few comments on the title itself. So, right, one possibility or one way of understanding this is the question, is so-called Taoist medicine actually possible? But one of the things I'm looking at is also the kind of question of the relationship between Taoism and Chinese medicine. So again, is that possible or is that impossible? And the reason Taoist medicine is in scare quotation marks is because it's increasingly being used in the Chinese medical community to talk about a particular kind of medicine, and there's a question. Does that actually exist in pre-modern China? So this is part of what I'm going to look at today. So what I want to talk about is the question of Taoist medicine, including critical reflections on this apparently modern category. And I'll talk about why I think both are problematic, both the use of the category, but also the dismissal of this possibility, because I think it is possible. So one of the things I want to say here is, even though there are critical comments that I'll give you, I'm sympathetic to this. I'm interested in it. I want to support the inquiry into it. So I'm thinking about this as a contemplative inquiry and maybe a public thought experiment, and I want to give particular attention to the Taoist question. So why am I thinking about this these days? Because the Taoist Translation Committee that was organized through the Taoist Foundation, and some of the members are here, we just completed a complete annotated translation of the Bao Pu Zi Nei Pian, so the inner chapters of Master Embracing Simplicity. This is forthcoming, so it's going to be a 2-volume set. It's a complete annotated translation, so it's heavily annotated. It also has a text critical dimension. It's scheduled to be released in December of this year through Square Inch Press, which is the publishing branch of the Taoist Foundation. This is just a mock-up of the cover, so this isn't the actual cover, but this is just to give you a sense of what it might be, a taste of what it is. And this is the first translation from the Taoist Translation Committee. So as I mentioned, this was organized through the Taoist Foundation, and you can kind of find more information about it. It's a collaborative, so it's a group of people that intentionally came together, and in this case specifically to translate this very difficult early medieval Taoist text, the Bao Pu Zi Nei Pian. Also, what came up in this, and a lot of you probably know, although it isn't as accessed as it should be on this, is the degree to which Ge Hong, the author of this work, is really engaging Chinese herbology. So there's a lot of detail about Chinese herbology. There's also a critique of certain kinds of engagements with Chinese herbology, which is quite interesting for present purposes. But what this meant was the Taoist medicine question came to the fore. how do we think about Go Hong? How do we think about his herbology? How do we think about the way that that herbology feeds into maybe the classical Chinese medical tradition? So this is partly why this is on my mind. It might be a little surprising to some of you who know my work. Why is Louis Komjathy talking about Taoist medicine? But this is why. It's coming out of this book project took about 4 years to do. So my areas of specialization are Taoist education, Taoist hermeneutics, Taoist literature, Taoist meditation, Taoist translation, and of course Trinjen complete perfection Taoism. So that's where a lot of my specialized research has been historically. But why am I showing you this? Because you can see what's not on this list. That's why. Not Chinese medicine. Right? So Taoist medicine isn't on this list. So it's a bit strange, right, for me to be talking about it. But one of the reasons is I'm located in the Taoist tradition. I'm encountering Taoists who are self-identifying as practitioners of Taoist medicine or Taoist medical physicians and these kinds of things. So I'm thinking through these questions. But I do have some knowledge and some training in Chinese medicine. I'm also married to Kate Townsend, who's the co-director of the Taoist Foundation, and she's an advanced East Asian medical practitioner. So we have a lot of dialogic exchanges, right? Discussions about these kinds of critical issues, also related to her direct experience with classical Chinese medicine. And so one of the reasons to also say this is I'm not representing her views, but this is in conversation with her. It is informed by her expertise. But in terms of my own location, and we can talk about this as self-contextualization, I'm on the Taoist study side of this. I'm not on the medicine side. I'm also on the tradition-based Taoist side. So I'm really thinking through this question from more of a Taoist scholar practitioner perspective, and that's not to say practitioners of so-called Taoist medicine aren't. It's to say, though, that's not where I'm located. I'm not located in Chinese medicine. I'm located in Taoist studies. I'm located in the Taoist tradition in probably a different way than a lot of people. So what do we mean by Taoist medicine? Do we mean medicine created by Taoists? Do we mean medicine informed by Taoism? Do we mean medicine practiced by Taoists? Right? Does it have to be all of those things? So I've written about this a little bit in some of my work on Taoist material culture. We can think about Taoist art, right? So Taoist art can be thought about in similar ways. But how are we going to define Taoist medicine? How do we understand it? Another dimension of this question, so I'm having us kind of think critically through the category. Another dimension of this question is it medicine being practiced by Taoists among Taoists? Right? Because think about Taoist art in context. So temple art, the way that it's used religiously, and these kinds of things. So is Taoist medicine so-called practiced among Taoists different than Taoist medicine practiced among the general population or non-Taoist, quote unquote? And does that have certain kinds of problems? So common misconceptions and misrepresentations of this is the association of these things with Taoism, or the conflation of these things with Taoism. So correlative cosmology, the 5 elements or the 5 phases, Wuxing cosmology, yin-yang cosmology, the I Ching, the classic of change, or anything self-identified Taoist claim. Right? So there's this kind of idea of when we really talk about Taoist medicine, what are the Taoist characteristics? We have to have some degree of religious literacy about Taoism to answer that question. If we begin with this, if we begin with a misconception or a misrepresentation of these things associated with Taoism, then we're not going to understand what Taoist medicine is. We're going to misinterpret or misrepresent so-called Taoist medicine with what we could talk about as classical Chinese medicine or traditional Chinese medicine. So one issue that comes up in this is the question of reconstructed practice, especially with so-called classical Chinese medicine and so-called Taoist medicine. Almost everything that's being presented through this lens is reconstructed, right? It's based upon text, it's based upon a kind of historical retrieval project. And so there's this kind of lineage question. Where is this coming from? Where was it created? Why is it being presented this way? Across the board. So a lot of the people that have been involved in the Taoist Translation Committee are actually involved in classical Chinese medicine. So we've had these direct conversations. And so there's this question of the source point of the materials and how it's being presented and why it's being reconstructed this way. So one of the reasons to bring this up here is that then, of course, those of you who are on this side of things, that is the actual practitioner side or the physician side, it's like what's going on the clinical level. So in terms of clinical practice and clinical experience, if people are using reconstructed practice in a clinical setting, how do we know it's efficacious? Right? So one of the ways that people will frame this is, well, I've been using it for this period of time and it's efficacious. It's like that's a relatively short period of time compared to like other forms of classical Chinese medicine maybe, or traditional Chinese medicine, however you're going to think about those terms. Sorry. So one correction about this is against literal-mindedness and technocratic interpretation. So what do I mean? If you look at conventional sinology, and those of you who've read my recent work know that I have a certain critique of like mainstream sinology, and especially what we can talk about as sinological Daoist studies. And by that I mean a very particular way of constructing Daoist studies and understanding Daoism. There are these attempts to kind of claim because certain terms didn't exist in a pre-modern Daoist context. So Daoist medicine, quote, right? Daoist medicine, quote unquote. So Dao Jiao Yi Shui or Dao Yi or something like this, that there's no Daoist medicine. And from my perspective, this is a kind of superficial way of going about the research. The question is, were there Daoists engaging in like the practice of Chinese medicine? If so, how were they doing it? So just because they didn't say we're practicing Daoist medicine doesn't mean they weren't practicing Daoist medicine. Okay, this is one of the kind of conceptual questions. And so again, for those of you who know my work, and especially my more recent work on classical Daoism, this is one of the explicit things I'm exploring. So people will say, well, when does Dao Jia, so-called Dao Jiao, the family of the way, the family of the Dao, appear? And they'll say, well, it doesn't appear before, let's say, the early 1st century BCE. So there's no Daoism before that, or that category is problematic. But if you actually go through the classical Daoist materials carefully, you find there are all kinds of self-referential names there, right? And so rather than assuming a certain concept and going back and searching for it, you start with the question. The question is, are there Daoists in the late Warring States period and early Western Han Dynasty? Absolutely yes, no doubt. Okay. And so again, if you want all of the evidence, right, this is especially in the more recent Dao De Jing book, but I have a commentary on the Zhuangzi coming out that I go through kind of systematically there too. And the reason to say that is because there's a lot of debate about this, but there's not a lot of investigation of the question through the sources themselves with this kind of revisionist framework. So what I'm doing here is saying, like, we can't just dismiss Daoist medicine because you can't find pre-modern Daoists saying they practice Daoist medicine. That's a kind of complicated question of like, why would they say that? Or when would they say that? So thinking about some potential pre-modern Daoist physicians, this is just a kind of list of some of the key figures. So Hua Tuo might be a name that you know, Ge Hong, Tao Hong Jing, Sun Simiao, Sam brought Sun Simiao earlier, Wang Bing. So there's a lot of things that are interesting about this. I'm not going to unpack all of this here. You're welcome to explore it more on your own. But there's a few things, right? There's some major works connected to classical Chinese medicine and that feed into classical Chinese medicine or intersect or cross-pollinate with classical Chinese medicine. And so again, I know that for some people it's problematic to think of like, oh, there's Taoism over here and there's classical Chinese medicine over here, but there are these distinct traditions. So there's a question of the overlap. There's a question of the intersection, the cross-pollination of it. But two stand out here for a couple reasons, especially in terms of this particular talk, the Daoist medicine question. So Ge Hong, right, who is the author of what I mentioned before, the Bao Puzi Neipian, so this really important text, especially for kind of reconstructing classical Chinese herbology, and you'll see that in the book. There's a very lengthy table of all the different herbs in the Bao Puzi Neipian that we composed for the book. So thinking about this question, well, Ge Hong was actually the key systematizer of the Tai Ching of the Great Clarity tradition. So you have a Taoist, right, one of the most prominent early medieval Taoists, who's deeply engaged with Chinese medicine. And again, there's a question of how do we think about Chinese medicine, but I'm using it fairly broadly to say, well, he was definitely doing things like that we can talk about as herbology. he looks like he was married to a very like important female physician and so on, and that's a story for another day. Tao Hong Jing, so you can see his dates, was really important early transitioning into late medieval Taoist, and also the 9th Shangqing highest clergy patriarch. So you have people, these potential Chinese physicians who actually were really prominent in the Taoist tradition. So they're kind of clear examples of people participating in both traditions, but also contributing to both traditions in important ways. So one thing as we transition into the Taoist medicine question is, what is illness? What do we mean when we say somebody is ill or there is illness in the world? So we really need to pause and think about this. So not our assumptions, right? Not our ingrained opinions, not assuming a particular medical system and what it tells us about illness. But what is illness actually? Right? So one part of this is phenomenologically speaking, that is on a descriptive level, what is illness? And then how do people tend to interpret or define a condition that isn't necessarily illness, right? Illness is a categorization, right? Is that experience, is that condition actually illness? So thinking about the difference between subjective experience and cultural constructs, so there's a way that we can make this distinction. It's a little problematic, but I find it helpful, that illness refers to the subjectively perceived and experienced ailment or discomfort, including accompanying familial, cultural, and social influences. Disease refers to the culture-specific categorization and diagnosis, usually in the context of specific medical approaches and systems. So this is via Arthur Kleinman, who you may know, this important medical anthropologist, also worked on China. So he's important for this topic in particular. But also more radically, I don't know if you know R.D. Laing, he's quite controversial, but he wrote an important book, especially in my way of thinking about these things, called The Politics of Experience. And it's kind of taken me through a lot of challenges with being in Daoist studies, but also being in this kind of public framework. So he's talking about kind of psychological and psychiatric categorization, and he says, schizophrenia is a diagnosis, a label applied by some people to others. This does not prove the labeled person is subject to an essentially pathological process of unknown nature and origin going on in his or her body. It does not mean that the process is primarily or secondarily a psychopathological one going on in the psyche of the person. But it does establish as a social fact that the person labeled is one of them. There is no such condition, quote unquote, as schizophrenia, quote unquote, but the label is a social fact, and the social fact a political event. This political event occurring in the civic order of society imposes definitions and consequences on the labeled person. The person labeled is inaugurated not only into a role, but into a career of a patient by the concerted action of a coalition. Okay? So this is kind of high level kind of intellectual reflection. But what is it talking about? It's talking about the subjective experience, whatever subjective experience we have. And if you said to the person, what's going on, they're giving you a first person description of that, of what's happening, whatever the contents of that description are. And then there's a whole group of experts, whatever the area of expertise. So we're thinking about medicine now. So we're thinking about illness, but illness, quote unquote, becoming disease, quote unquote, that then have these categorizations, right? So if you go to a TCM practitioner, the way they're going to diagnose the condition is through that particular system. The way they're going to treat you is through that particular system. And you can kind of look at this through each system. So again, this is a radical claim because there's a question of, does the condition actually exist? Right? So there's the phenomenological pattern, and I know, again, maybe this is a little complicated, but there's the phenomenological pattern of the subjective experience, and then there's the labeling and the interaction and the kind of framing of the person. So also, therefore, the placement of the person and the way then that interprets that person's experience for them, conditions them to view themselves, conditions them to view their life, and all of these kinds of things. The kind of treatment that they accept then, all of these things. So this is partly why I'm bringing it to our attention, because there is the question then of what is disease, quote unquote, from the point of view of Taoist medicine. So we can think about, and Sam, I think, alluded to this in the introductory comments, the standard Chinese medical etiology, or the causation of disease, right? And again, now we're not in illness, quote unquote, we're in disease in terms of what I was just talking about. So how is disease understood? So you have these different categories. The ancestral, so I've given you a little bit of historical context. You can find this in ancient Shang religion and also Chinese popular religion. The cause is ancestors, so deceased relatives, and the response is pacification. So this is, right, my interpretive framework. You can kind of say, I don't know if that's the best response, the best way to think about the response. I'm just giving you some things to think about. So the important thing here is my ancestors aren't your ancestors. So the cause of this ancestral disease from this perspective is person specific or family specific, right? So that cause will be within my own kind of ancestral genealogy. Demonological, so this, you find this in Chinese popular religion and medieval Daoism. The cause are demons, and so there's a question of what does that mean, but definitely this sense of malevolent entities on some level, including disenfranchised dead. So the primary response is exorcism, right? You have to expel them from the person or from the situation. Naturalistic, also referred to as climactic, so the classical Chinese medicine, so it's pan-Chinese, climatic, I should say. And so the reason that it's asterisk is this becomes normative. So if you're sitting here and you're thinking about illness or disease from a traditional Chinese perspective, and I don't mean a traditional Chinese medical perspective, I mean much more broadly than that in terms of correlative cosmology, this is the primary way it's understood. So the cause is cosmological and seasonal harmony. So for example, the six climactic influences, so the Liu Qi, right? Literally the six Qi, the six energies, and the response is reharmonization. Also, after Buddhism is introduced into China and Buddhism takes root in China, you have a stronger kind of emphasis on maybe something that can be understood as a karmic cause of illness or disease. So karma, the universal law of moral cause and effect. And the response is purification, including rectification and atonement. This is partly influenced by Paul Unschild's work on this kind of history of ideas or intellectual genealogy framework. And so one of the reasons to put this here is, the assumptions that people will make about illness and disease, even in a kind of Chinese medical context. But if you look at it more broadly, especially historically and in terms of traditional Chinese culture, there can be many possible causes, many influences, And if we're thinking through this as I do, and I'll show you this in a moment, from more of a lived perspective, then what does this mean, right? The way that we understand our own conditions. It doesn't have to be illness, it doesn't have to be disease. It can be psychological challenges. It can be spiritual obstructions, right? And you don't have to think about it so narrowly. So this is one of the reasons I like it. You don't have to think about ancestral, like literally my ancestors are out there and they're upset with me. It's like you have a certain kind of genealogical influence. So there are many ways to think through this from a lived perspective. So this moves into probably a little bit more controversial area. So this is me thinking through the question of Taoist medicine from the Taoist tradition, not necessarily from the Chinese medical tradition. So this is me, right? Me trying to come up with some kind of systematization of it. So the first thing is medicine-less medicine, the medicine of no medicine. I'll show you this in a moment. This is classical Taoism. So when you look at this, it's actually not medicine. It's talking about a very particular kind of practice that you do, what I tend to refer to as Taoist quietism, and also apophatic meditation, so emptiness and stillness-based meditation. This is the kind of core practice that you do in classical Taoism. So, right, so if you think about the medical question, they're saying you have to do this practice, right? And then you see there's all kinds of potentially yang-sheng dimensions of it. And I don't mean yang-sheng in the narrow sense that I'll get into in a moment, but yang-sheng in a broader sense of the cultivation of one's own vitality, that there will be vitality, there will be protection from harm and these kinds of things. Cosmological medicine, you also find this in classical Taoism. There's an emphasis on cosmological attunement, including seasonal awareness and energetics. I'll show you this in a moment as well. So this overlaps with classical Chinese medicine, especially in the Huangdi Neijing Su Wen, so the Yellow Thearch's Interclassic Basic Questions. So there's an interesting question there. I showed you that earlier with Wang Bing, the primary redactor of the received text, of, well, what's the overlap between these emerging traditions? And at the time, especially in the early layers of the Su Wen, they would be emerging simultaneously. So what was the overlap? Was there cross-pollination? These are difficult questions to answer. But the emphasis here is on cosmological attunement. So is it medicine? This is partly why I'm bringing it to you. So what do we mean by medicine? Is it preventative medicine? It's a way to stay strong, to stay vital, and then you won't actually become ill. What do you do if you become ill? So are there actually interventionist methods there? So there are these kinds of questions in that early phase. And I know for some of you this might not be as familiar because this is obviously a revisionist framework for understanding Taoism, but I've written about it a lot. So if you know my work, you know classical Taoism is just a given in my work, regardless of how it's kind of engaged or not engaged in mainstream society, whether it's Daoist studies or kind of American society or the larger culture. Moralistic medicine, you find this in early Taoism. So as far as we can tell, especially through reconstructions of the Tianshi, the Celestial Masters movement, for example, there's this emphasis on moral purity, including precept study and application. So there's a view in early Taoism that, right, as long as you have moral purity, you won't become sick. So if you become sick, it's a sign of moral impurity. So then you have to like remedy that. And so part of it is you go through this process of moral purification. Longevity medicine, that's probably more familiar to us, and I know there are going to be some talks on this. So early medieval Taoism, and obviously a lot of these continue. I'm just telling you when they start to emerge. So an emphasis on Yangsheng, on nourishing life practice, including what we talk about as like a full spectrum approach. So that's not Yangsheng in a narrow sense of something like modern Qigong. Right? It includes dietetics, it includes ethics, includes a lot of things that we might not normally categorize that way, especially from a modern perspective. Immortality medicine, so this starts in early medieval Taoism. So the Bao Pu Zi Neipian would be an example of this, the text that I was just talking to you about, the inner chapters of Master Embracing Simplicity. So this emphasis on herbology and external alchemy. But this is one of the things that's interesting about Ge Hong, and this is why I'm kind of problematizing the category of Taoist medicine. Ge Hong thinks ordinary herbology is basically irrelevant. So if you think about classical Chinese herbology, Ge Hong is like, yeah, I mean, if you want to work on illness or you want to kind of prevent illness, fine, be interested in that. But the most important thing is Waidan, is external alchemy. So you actually have to know the ingredients to make the elixir of immortality. So there's that kind of immortality medicine where there are all these grades. So he's literally in real time in the text categorizing different herbs, categorizing different minerals, and saying these are the minerals you have to gather and use, and you have to know how to decoct them into this particular elixir. Okay? So it's pretty radical, but when I used to teach undergraduates religious studies, and especially Taoism, I used to talk about this is like multivitamins or the pharmaceutical industry. It's some kind of weird specialized thing that you get, like you get these pills and you take them. So that's a kind of generalized way of understanding it, but it is interesting because people find external alchemy so strange a lot of the time in the modern world. And it's like, it's not that strange if you actually think through it, that people are taking external substances for a variety of reasons, okay? And then talismanic medicine, this is the kind of, I'd say the type of medicine that tends to get conflated with Taoist medicine, quote unquote, in the modern world. So this starts to appear in late medieval Taoism. It's a Taoist interventionist ritual approach, including demonological and exorcistic concerns with corresponding dermatological remedies. So that's just a fancy way of talking about, in this case, magical. So there's some kind of magical intervention to it. Sorry. So I want to show you two examples, right? Because this is more of a revisionist, maybe more radical understanding of what Taoist medicine might be. and challenge or problematize certain ways that Taoist medicine, quote unquote, is being constructed in the modern world. So the first is the medicine of no medicine. So again, I'm coining these terms, right? The Taoists at the time are not saying we practice the medicine of no medicine. It sounds kind of Zen, right? Or medicineless medicine. But you find this especially in the Zhuangzi. So for those of you who know the Zhuangzi, right, this classical Taoist text that has layers from the 4th to the 2nd centuries BCE, there are these famous passages about death and dying in the Zhuangzi. So what happens to you when you become ill, or what happens to you when you're dying, from a Taoist perspective, right? So children obeying their father and mother go wherever they are told, east or west, south or north. And yin and yang, how much more are they to a person than father and mother? Now that they have brought me to the verge of death, if I do not listen, how defiant I would be. What fault is it of theirs? The great clod burdens me with form, labors me with life, eases me in old age, and rests me in death. So if I think well of my life, for the same reason, I must think well of my death. Now, when a great smith is casting metal, if the metal should leap up and say, I insist upon being made into a moye sword, he would surely regard it as very inauspicious metal indeed. Now, having had the audacity to take on human form once, if I should say, human only human, the transformative process, 造化, would surely regard me as a most inauspicious sort of person. So now I think of heaven and earth as the great forge, and the transformative process as the great smelting. Where could it send me that I would not be all right? I will go off to sleep peacefully, and then with a start, I will wake up. So the last part problematizes a little bit, right? Because it makes it sound like, oh, death is going to sleep, and then there's going to be another side of death. So I think that's an open question in classical Taoism. But the key piece here is, what are we doing with illness and dying and death? And we're accepting it. So if you go back to that previous set of categories that I gave you in classical Taoism, this is assuming, and this is one of the things people miss all of the time when they read classical Taoist texts, whether it's the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, the Zhuangzi, the Book of Esther Zhuang, or other texts that are less well known, is it assumes apophatic meditation. It assumes that you are deep in emptiness and stillness-based meditation. So what happens in that process, right? And these are the kinds of practices that we do. So this is also speaking to you from more of a lived perspective. You actually go through the dying process in the practice, right? You find out that you're misidentifying with what you are. So there's also a mystical dimension of this, yeah? So there's this idea in Zen, right? Die while alive, and then when you come to die, there is no death, right? And it's not coincidental. That's kind of implicit here, that you die to the known. You die to what you think you are. And when you do this, death is just another moment in the transformative process. So it brings up all kinds of questions for medicine. Should you even practice interventionist medicine from a Taoist perspective? Of course, this is a particular Taoist perspective. So we can bring in other Taoist perspectives and say, well, there's interventionist medicine or interventionist kinds of approaches in other forms of Taoism. And it's like, right, but how do we take this particular Taoist view seriously? You know, so I've been talking about this with a number of people. I think this is an interesting possible application to something like hospice care from a Taoist perspective. Right. So rather than wanting the person to stay alive, or rather than being attached to, well, can we actually get them back to health or wellness? It's like, no, they're in the end stages of life. How do you help them with that? And there is this Taoist emphasis on acceptance, on open receptivity. So as I said, this is more contemplative and even quietistic. I don't know how familiar you are with these kinds of categories, but one way to understand this quietistic approach, which is more the kind of approach that we tend to follow, is there's a submersion of individual will into the larger reality of the Tao, which includes nature as this transformative process. So what that means then is there's not a demand for life to be in a particular way. And one thing that comes up here, and this is coming out of a larger kind of comparative study, so I think a lot of you know that I have a PhD in comparative religious studies. So in this larger kind of comparative frame, it comes out of investigation of other contemplative literature and other mystical literature where people will say illness is grace. So that may or may not resonate with you, the grace concept, but there's a fair amount of this in other traditions where rather than thinking of illness as negative, it actually is some kind of divine gift and it's revealing something. And a lot of people who come to Taoism, and that may be the case with some of you, a lot of the people who come to Taoism in our world come through a kind of healing journey. It's like, right, so what does that mean in terms of illness? Wasn't illness grace then on some level? So from a Taoist perspective, you can say, and I talk about this a lot with Taoist practitioners, right? You have certain kinds of challenges in your life. Well, it's awakening you to certain things. It's directing you to certain things. It maybe is making you more serious as a Taoist practitioner than if you are always well and you took your constitution and your health and vitality for granted. Another example is classical Taoist cosmological medicine. So this is also coming out of the Zhuangzi. But Tian Dao is very interesting because Tian Dao or Tianzhi Dao, the way of heaven, is also in the Tao Te Ching. So it looks like at the time it's a pan-Chinese way of thinking about this kind of cosmological understanding of this transformative process. So this is also from the Zhuangzi, the Book of Mestrong. Through celestial veneration and terrestrial modesty, one becomes seated in divine illumination. Proceed in spring and summer, follow long in autumn and winter. Such is the sequence of the 4 seasons. The 10,000 things transform and grow, with each sprouting curl having a distinctive shape. Such are the gradations of flourishing and decline, the currents of alteration and transformation. So when you think about this, it's really understanding the Tao as nature, as a transformative process, and this has been brought up a couple times. What is the larger cosmological cycle that we're in? What is the larger seasonal cycle that we're in? And those of you who know classical Chinese medicine will recognize that there's overlap here. So if you look at the Su 1 and especially Su 1, the basic questions, chapter 1 and 2, it kind of aligns with that. So how do we harmonize ourselves with the natural cycles? Again, if you think about this in terms of medicine, what kind of medicine is it? Right? And it's a medicine that's saying, if you actually follow these principles, you will be harmonized and you won't become ill. That's the assumption. So health and wellness is the normal state of being, right? Illness and disease indicate some kind of misalignment or misattunement. So this idea then of finding a way to attune ourselves, and then you get into all kinds of things like the time question, the cosmological cycles, if those of you who know like the seasonal nodes, but even things like the pentads. I mean, you can go very deep in Taoism in terms of various types of kind of temporal attunement. But then, and again, I think this is a way to understand that maybe there is more potential, at least cross-pollination or intersection between something like an emerging classical Chinese medical tradition and the Taoist tradition, is that it seems like there's a shared understanding of that. Like as human beings, and you can think about this in modern terms as something like ecological awareness or ecological attunement, that we have this natural connection. And if we listen to it, there will be this greater harmonization. So we might not need interventionist medicine, or interventionist medicine is a sign that that's been lost. And this is one of the reasons I'm showing you the first two. So these two classical Taoist models is to say, like, maybe they offer a different kind of window or insight into the way that we think about medicine and illness and so on. So from a lived and living Taoist perspective, I'm kind of encouraging us to think about illness, suffering, and death in the human condition and Taoist cultivational responses to that. There's not a set response. Right. So again, this is one of the issues I have with the way that so-called Taoist medicine is being framed is this the only way to respond to these kinds of aspects of the human condition from a Taoist perspective? And are they always beneficial? Also thinking about classical and foundational Taoist views and approaches. So there's an acceptance of change in as through beyond illness. Right? So what's really happening? And this is why I brought up the illness disease kind of concept. Right? We're categorizing a certain kind of condition, a certain subjective experience as illness maybe from our own perspectives, but also possibly disease from another perspective. But hypothetically, especially from a classical and foundational Taoist perspective, it's all part of the transformative process. So are there other ways of working with it? And again, we can broaden it out and say, yes, I mean, Chinese medicine recognizes this as well. It's not just acupuncture and moxibustion and herbology and things like that. There's many other dimensions that can be used. Wellness narratives beyond illness narratives. This is something I use a lot in my own life and also teachings. This is partly connected to Kleinman, which is that what we tend to get are these illness narratives, especially in received cultural influences. So there are all these problems that we have, or there are all these things that we have to resolve. And from my perspective, especially classical and foundational Taoism is a wellness narrative. It's not an illness narrative. So what does it tell us? It tells us we came into the world with this innate nature, Xing, right? That was originally inherently connected to the Tao. That's a wellness narrative. We didn't come in misaligned. We didn't come in confused, right? People become confused later through various influences, but innate nature is always there, right? That's more of that quietistic view. Or we know how to attune with the seasons, right? We want to sleep more in fall. We want to sleep even more in winter. We might not be able to, but like the wisdom of the body is telling us that. So that's part of this wisdom, this wellness narrative from a Taoist perspective. Also engaging radical Taoist perspectives. So I started with that etiology, the causation of illness or disease. So ancestral, energetic, ethical, and karmic dimensions. This may or may not resonate with you, but I think there's a deep Taoist insight and wisdom in this about like what's actually influencing our constitutions, what's determining our current state of being. There are many factors, right? Some factors may be hidden. Some factors may be unrecognized. So that larger map of what I'm suggesting might be like a kind of pre-modern Taoist medicine includes all of these things. Also beyond a therapeutic approach and mentality, including interventionism. So that is defining all of these things in terms of health and wellness. And right, like if you're ill, then you have to like have some kind of intervention, it's like, or do you need to rest more? Or do you need to eat better? It obviously depends on the condition. But right, this is a famous line from Wang Zhe, the founder of Quanzhen Complete Perfection, right? Eat when hungry, sleep when tired. Sounds like good Taoist medical advice, right? So especially from a Yang-Sheng perspective. And then beyond the health and wellness industry, so this is one of a lot of you know my work, I'm sure, this way, so I have a certain kind of critique of it. I have certain resistance to certain kinds of, I think, like appropriative agendas. So does Taoist medicine, quote unquote, or at least the possibility of Taoist medicine represent something different? Something that might be a resistance point or something more radical than just allowing itself to be taken into this. And I understand, right? I'm sympathetic to people making a living. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying like you shouldn't be doing this in terms of a clinical setting, but it's like, how are you negotiating that? How are you negotiating things like insurance industry and these kinds of things? And then beyond the known and received. So these are some suggestions about how we kind of move forward. Thinking about the potential intersection and cross-pollination between classical Chinese medicine and Taoism. The question of Taoist physicians in Chinese history and their location in the Taoist tradition. So again, I think this is where you have to go back to my preliminary points, my kind of primary framing points about, well, what do we mean by Taoist medicine? Are these just, and I don't mean it in a pejorative sense, are these just Taoists practicing classical Chinese medicine? Or are they practicing medicine in a particularly Taoist way? And again, that's where Gohong is kind of interesting, but also kind of strange, because he's really not interested in what you could talk about as ordinary or conventional medicine. He's interested in what I was labeling immortality medicine. Also the exploration and understanding of associated Taoist views of illness, disease, health, wellness, and so forth. The promises and perils of actual Taoist medicine. So now I'm kind of moving us into this modern period of people invoking Taoist medicine. So there's something there that's really kind of saying we should like investigate the Taoist tradition. Maybe the Taoist tradition has something to contribute to the practice of medicine. But there's also this peril there about the construction of Taoist medicine for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to get into that today. I'm not really interested in deconstructing this. I'm just interested in bringing attention to it and suggesting there's certain critical issues that need to be addressed. Resistance to the co-optation by TCM schools and corporatized Chinese medicine. So that's more of a critical point about, how is Taoist medicine now being kind of put into that educational framework? Why? Why now? How is it being constructed? Who's constructing it that way? There are all these kinds of challenging questions that normally don't get addressed. Also beyond modern identity politics and social constructs, so that is using the invocation of Taoist or ordination or lineage to kind of advance a certain kind of position of authority in it. And then there's still the question of like, well, what's the relationship of those two things? What does your Taoist ordination have to do with the practice of Chinese medicine? How did it come to be that you're both? Why do you think those things are related? These are difficult questions, right? So again, I know a number of people that are in Taoist medicine, and it's like an ongoing conversation about, okay, well, how are you rooted in the tradition? How are you practicing something called Taoist medicine rather than something that you might call classical Chinese medicine and just labeling it Taoist? And there's a lot of that. Also beyond traditionalization and the rhetoric of tradition. So I don't know how familiar you are to these things. These are kind of technical, kind of academic distinctions, but there are a lot of studies of this about how things become traditionalized, quote unquote. That is, it's not actually a tradition. There's a rhetoric of tradition. So there's a construction of it retrospectively as having lineage connections. So one of the ideas here, and I'm almost done, Sam, if you're keeping track of time, one of the ideas here is like invented traditions. That isn't necessarily bad, but the question is like, but if you're invoking a certain kind of lineage, a certain kind of tradition, is it really there? And this goes back to my point about reconstructed practice. Most of it's reconstructed. So then if you're invoking lineage, where is the actual lineage connection? And I obviously could talk about this a lot more on the Taoist side, because this is like a lot of what I've investigated about questions of lineage connection through different movements and different lineages and sublineages. So the last point is just the question of authority, expertise, and representation, right? So one thing I think about a lot is the kind of representation or the presentation or the construction of Taoism in TCM schools. And it's like, but if you did a substitution method and you said, okay, we're going to have Taoist scholars or Taoist adherents who aren't really trained in Chinese medicine teach the foundations of Chinese medicine, would that be accepted? Right? So it's like this kind of expertise question of who's constructing what in what way and who's being accepted as an authority on what topic. So from my perspective, this is not a dismissal of it. It's a kind of request or invitation or ideally suggestion for the necessity of collaboration and dialogue, having actual religious literacy concerning the religious tradition, which is Taoism, and even tradition-based Taoist adherent views and insights be included. Thanks. Sobe.
Louis, thank you so much. You touched on a lot of really cool points. You can drop your questions in the chat as I give a couple sentences, but that's something that we always go back and forth within the Taoist community of, do we put wellness in the title of some of these things? Because on the surface, we are looking for wellness, but on a deeper level, there's a whole industry that when we use certain language that we are aligning with or not aligning with. So you brought up a bunch of really good points. So I'll check the chat here and see what questions are in here. So Servan asks you, was curing illnesses a common practice among the 5 bushels community?
Right. So the 5 bushels is a kind of certain way of constructing, right, the Tianchi, the celestial masters, right, community. So we usually, right, in terms of the actual movement, we usually talk about the Tianchi or the celestial masters. It eventually becomes talked about as Zhengyi, orthodox unity. So this is what I referred to as the early Taoist piece about, were they curing illness? Yes, right. So they were thinking that it's very interesting. This is what I was talking about in terms of the kind of moralistic or the moral construction of illness and or disease and wellness. So this is what I was mentioning. You probably didn't pick it up in terms of the way that illness was being constructed. So the categorization of disease was immorality. So when you teach this to people, and again, you can just look at it as a historical artifact. I don't think it's a historical artifact. There's a question of the cultivation of virtue, right? Serious Taoists are always talking about deqing, right? Virtue. So virtue practice is generally thought about as foundational, So there are these kinds of historical connections through the Taoist tradition. This is a lot of the work that I try to do, is think through these questions. But in terms of this particular question, yes, and this gets disturbing for people, right? Because it's like, wait, I'm ill because I'm immoral? Well, maybe, not necessarily, but if you were in the early Celestials Masters community, and again, this is like, a lot of this is hypothetical, conjectural, reconstructed, because there's so little sources. But as far as we can tell, there was that understanding, and again, I should be like maybe more technically accurate, of disease, because it was a categorization of disease, as about morality and immorality. And so therefore, the therapeutic response was moral purification. So these, and some of you probably know this about things like the pure chambers and moral purification and going there and basically doing moral rectification. So again, the precept piece is somewhat complicated because of the history, the historical dimensions of the precepts, how we date them and so on. But it looks, at least on some level, that they had this kind of program of like, when you went into this secluded space and you went through this moral purification process, you were doing some kind of examination of your conduct, which probably for a lot of you sounds fairly familiar, especially if you know something like Longman Dragon Gate lineage, that's like based on precept study and application. At least technically, that's what it's supposed to be based on. That's the charism, right? The spiritual characteristic of Longman of Dragon Gate. So yes, as far as we can tell, there was that sense, but this is radically different. That's my point. So if you go back to that kind of etiology framework, it's not naturalistic. That's not how they're thinking about it. They're thinking about it, it's largely you, but, and this is, I think, one of the things that's interesting for Taoists, and Sam, you brought up the Taoist community, for especially people participating in the Taoist tradition in this lived way, is what's also about the community. What's happening in the community? So is the community actually living a moral life? Or is the community living an immoral life? So now you're having all of these people become ill. The last thing I'll say about this, because I want to be careful, because I'm not trying to make normative statements about what's Taoist medicine, or, oh, the real Taoist medicine is the medicine of no medicine. That's not the point of my talk. The point of my talk is to try to give you a broader sense of what might kind of fall into that category. Is we have to be careful with this, because if you say this to people, they take it to heart. People do this all the time. It's like, oh, I must have done something horrible in a past life to have this condition. It's like, maybe, but it also might be your ancestry. Or if you're being more sophisticated, it might be environmental factors. We know this much more now. So when you kind of think about all of the different aspects, it's not one. And this is what people tend to do with Taoism. So again, if you look at, and I see their questions, so I'll be very quick with this last point. If you look at my larger work of trying to think through the tradition and develop like more viable interpretive frameworks and systems, it's very diverse, right? So people tend to focus on this particular model or this particular approach, and that's fine. That's what Taoists tend to do. But if you do that with this, you then start to think like, oh, it's all about immorality. It's like, no, it could also be ancestral, right? It could also be karmic. It could also be cosmological. You keep going with this. And so if you're actually doing, and again, I don't do this professionally, if you're doing the diagnostics, it's really complicated. Right? Okay, Sam, thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that what you're saying right there is a larger issue of trying to understand arts that come from East Asia as a Western person, where we like everything to be black and white and kind of standardized. Whereas I think when I practice Chinese medicine, for example, it's as simple as I kind of like go through steps of I'm looking at it from this lens, I'm looking at it from this lens, and it's kind of just like looking at the same object, the proverbial elephant. And okay, from this angle, I see a trunk. From this angle, I see a tail. I have to walk around by putting on all of these perspectives. And I think the Taoist path in perspective is what you're saying is quite similar in the sense that if we only look at it from an ancestral perspective, we're missing, the moral perspective. And if we try to pick one, that's not usually how practitioners of these sort of arts practice. And you brought up a bunch of depth in your talk, which was lovely.
And I just want to say, Sam, and if you project your own Taoist position as normative, which is what you see fairly frequently, it leads to all kinds of confusion, especially, so this is what I brought up with the kind of Taoist identity question. The vying for positionality in Taoism is usually an assumption of a particular approach in a specific model as normative. Whereas, like, if you actually understand the tradition in a broader sense, you're like, that's what those Taoists tend to do. These Taoists tend to do this. Well, how do those relate? Well, you have to have those Taoists talk to each other. That's how they relate, They might have different views of it, including this, so I do want to say this, including the wellness question. Because it's like, and I say this to people all the time, I'm not a physician. I don't think of myself as a healer. That's not the basis of what I teach or how I practice. So just what you said, Sam, for sure, like from, I think, again, more of a traditional Taoist perspective, we recognize wellness as foundational, but then what else are you doing? So it's a kind of cultivation question. But sorry, Sam, keep going. There are other questions.
Yeah, so we have a couple things in the chat. One is not a question, but I'll read it out loud. Thank you so much resonated here with respect to disability and health things that this person has been navigating that led to the practice of Qigong and learning about Taoism. And I think a lot of people could probably resonate with that comment as well. This reframing of the health question that you brought up, this looking at illness as perhaps a window instead of simply a curse that we need to just take off of us. And yeah, Louis, I think, let's see. I see, here we go. Here's the question. Is it true, this is the honest question, is it true that even in China, the traditional Chinese medicine cut an important part of the knowledge of Taoist masters regarding the spiritual piece and the cosmological underpinnings that is a component of our qi and that is a knowledge important to understand our whole qi?
Yeah, I mean, this is complicated, and you're starting to get beyond my expertise, as I said. But with TCM, with traditional Chinese medicine, and again, this is part of what I'm trying to do a little bit in this talk because I'm loosely in these various circles of conversation, is the question of like when was traditional Chinese medicine, that's like TCM, TCM with uppercase, an uppercase acronym. When was it created, right? So this is a kind of 20th century creation, and there's a lot of things that have been written on this. So what was done in the creation of traditional Chinese medicine? And a lot of things that were done is like it was westernized, right? It was scientized, right? It was like actually things were taken out of it hypothetically. There's a question of like, did they intentionally take things out or were they not there? So this is why I brought up the traditionalization question. What was the received Chinese medical tradition that led to TCM, right? That's a complicated question. So, right, and you're talking to the wrong person, right? These are like, they're historians of Chinese medicine that are the people to talk to about this, right? You should talk to me about Taoism. But in this case, the reason I'm saying this particular piece is that's kind of known. So there is this move towards something like secular materialism, the allopathic medical paradigm, and all these kinds of things that would depart from what I was saying. Like, so if, and again, this isn't the time to be doing this, but it's like if you look at what tends to be talked about as the classical Chinese medical textual corpus, right? It's broader than these things. So the Suwan, that's how I prefer to abbreviate it. People will talk about it as the Neijing. I think that's not the best way to abbreviate it. The Suwan, the basic questions, there's like a different view in that text, right, than in some of the later parts of that text, especially the early layers of that text as far as we can tell, but also the later tradition, that then when you get into it, you're like, well, how does this then relate to a kind of broader Yangsheng tradition? And it's like, well, they're not the same, right? There's like Taoists who clearly aren't connected to Chinese medicine that are doing Yangsheng practice, they're systematizing Yangsheng practice, they're not even thinking about Yangsheng practice through a medical lens. That's why I said, I think we have to be careful with the therapeutic frame. It wasn't necessarily therapeutic. they're clearly examples of therapeutic Yangsheng, but they're also examples of Yangsheng where it's located in more of a Taoist cultivational framework. So with this, I think it's an open question of what was taken out, what was put in, how do these relate? But again, one of the points I'm trying to make in the talk is, when did something called classical Chinese medicine, quote unquote, start to appear, and why? And I think one of the reasons it starts to appear is a dissatisfaction with TCM as received. And it's like, and this very question, what was lost? What are we missing? Are there parts of our tradition that we can go back and reclaim? So again, those of you who know my work know I'm sympathetic to what I tend to talk about as like retrievalist work. So it's not like I'm saying, oh, it's illegitimate to go back to Tao Hong Jing and bring him into something like classical Chinese medicine. But there's that question of the efficacy of the reconstruction. If you're doing it for clinical purposes, a lot of people aren't. A lot of people are doing it for more like scholarly perspectives. So this particular piece, I think when you look at and so the Taoist masters, I think, is more open. But if you say, if I go back, right, to the Huangdi Neijing Suwan, the Yellow Theoretic and Classic Basic Questions, and especially some layer of that text that's really talking about cosmological attunement in the way I was saying with Taoism, classical Taoism, it's a totally different understanding of medicine, right? You basically are like, look, I'm here to tell you about lifestyle. And if you follow the principles of appropriate lifestyle, which kind of overlaps with the conduct question, you won't get sick, or it's much less likely that you'll get sick. And if you do get sick, it will be relatively minor. So it'll be relatively easy for us to reset you to wellness, right? Whereas if you don't follow those principles, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to become extremely ill. And this is what you see with the cosmological and seasonal changes. So that's part of what I'm kind of talking about, is at least some layer of the Suwan that overlaps with some layer of classical Taoism that's imagining cosmological attunement.
Yeah, that's a great response, and I think it was your point on the why was it created into a systematized version that we might see today is really relevant to modern practices of Taoism, modern practices of medicine, to modern practices of Yangsheng, all of that, because if you understand why, you can see some of the additions and subtractions. If there is a reason to make Chinese medicine more accessible to Western allopathic medicine, then you can see, oh, well, that's why they took it out. It's because it wasn't in vogue at the time. Perhaps it was even persecuted in a major way during times of relative instability and a lack of safety. So that's a great question. And I think Lewis is also alluding to something that we often miss, which is there's such a giant world. And when we talk about Taoism, we often have such a limited entry point outside of Chinese, Taoism or something like that. And it's really a wonderful, a goal of the conference to really promote that sort of dialogue so people have different access points and can see the bigger picture instead of just looking at these tiny little cracks in the wall and looking at this huge art, this huge mosaic behind a wall. And so one last question, because we're running out of time here. B is asking, is classical Chinese medicine a newer reconstructionist approach that is distinct from TCM?
Hypothetically, yes. So this is what I'm saying. So I'm saying, even though classical Chinese medicine is kind of being put forward as the alternative to traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, with that understanding of that being a very particular system of medicine that was developed at a very particular time in China and then obviously disseminated. And obviously it's broader. This is why I understand, like, there's East Asian medicine and there's probably some intact kind of traditions in Korea and Japan, and I don't know that, right? I don't know all of those materials. But in this case, yes, one of the things I'm saying is, when did you start to see people talking about classical Chinese medicine, and why? And I think it is partly a response to a dissatisfaction with the received TCM. But then some of that is reconstruction. So I don't know all the specifics. I know some of them, but I'm not interested in deconstructing people's livelihoods and people's presentations. So some of it I know. Some of it I'm like, this is a very strange construction. I don't know where this comes from or why it's being presented this way. But on the more positive side, I think there's also this kind of question of, well, is retrieval, so even if it is reconstruction or, and again, the traditionalization thing that I mentioned, and I know I'm throwing a lot of things, so I don't know if you followed that, but the whole idea of it's like 2,000 years old. It's like, who was practicing Suan-based medicine, like actually in their clinical practice? Yeah, I'd like to see the evidence. Or, oh, Sun Simiao was doing this. Great. Where's the evidence? I mean, this is all over. So with this, I'm not trying to disparage classical Chinese medicine. I'm sympathetic to it because that's a lot of the work that I do too. Like if you look at my work on classical Taoism, that's retrievalist, that's revisionist, that's reconstructed, and saying, yeah, but there's also a kind of living engagement with it. And I'm aware of the time, so I'll be quick about this. There's another lineage dimension of it. There's another tradition-based dimension. So it's not just like, look at Zhuangzi 4 and let's do Xinjia according to Zhuangzi 4. That's only one part of it. Yes, that's part of it. But there's a kodre connected to that through lineage. There's a root in that practice through a particular dimension of the tradition, specific movement, Chenjen, complete perfection, into specific lineage practices, lineage ways of understanding that. So it's like, well, then you're negotiating things. So the last thing I'll say about this, and this is one of the distinctions I try to make, when I'm teaching, is there's a retrievalist element, there's a lineal element, and there's a lived element. And again, if we're being Taoist about it, right, there's the idea of Zhentu, true earth. Just be honest about it. I know that's a lot to ask for some people, but I don't think so as a Taoist. Let's just be honest about it. Let's just talk about where it comes from, why it's being constructed this way, why it's being presented this way. So I know some of this is teacher-based. I'm aware of that. Like sometimes teachers tell a certain story, and then that story just gets repeated. And I understand that. That's part of training and that's part of lineage. But the historical or the revisionist part of me, the kind of work that I do, wants to know the source point. So the last thing I'll say is the Dao De Jing, right? Dao De Jing chapter 16 talks about Gui Gun, return to the root. So what's the root of it? What's the source of it? Where does it actually come from? And then if we're going to kind of keep going with this, where is it leading to? Sabay, thanks.
Thank you, Louis. That's actually, I think, the perfect way to segue into a break. I have nothing more to add. So thank you for your talk and for answering these questions in such a detailed way. And we will see you in 7 minutes for Stargazer Lee, who's going to guide us to working with the stars in our own practice in the night sky. So thank you. See you soon.